I want to begin by discussing what I see to be some very significant differences between the Baha'i approach to religion and the approach to religion of people in the world around us. I think it is important that we identify and focus on these differences, because as Baha'is we are engaged in reviving religion, in giving it new energy, giving it a new life in the world, and it is very important that we avoid falling into the pattern of religious practice of the people around us. If we fall into that trap, we will not be taking a new stand. We will not be reviving religion for the world of the future. Let me therefore examine certain characteristics which highlight the distinction between the Baha'i approach and the approach of people in the world around us. The first distinction is this: in the world around us, many people make a significant difference between religion as a creed and religion as a way of life. In other words, what they do in practice differs quite markedly from what they say is their belief. Let me give you some examples. One example is the fact that around us there are a great many people who say that their religious belief is that of turning the other cheek if somebody offends them or inflicts a hurt upon them. If you were to try an experiment, you would probably find that this doesn't occur in practice. That if you were to offend or hurt one such person, you could not rely upon his turning the other cheek. What would be more likely to happen is, in fact, that he would pick up a stone or a large brick and attack you with it. In other words, his practice would differ from what he states to be his formal belief. The same applies with such qualities as humility or modesty about one's own accomplishments. Most everybody around us says that they believe these are good qualities, yet so much of modern life is predicated upon the abandonment of humility, the abandonment of a modest assessment of one's own abilities and accomplishments in the name of putting oneself forward, of one's own advancement, of one's own progress at the expense of others. I mention this because it is important that for Baha'is there not be such a gap, that our practice conform to our statement of belief. And we must be forever on our guard lest we fall into the trap of making such a gap as exists with so many people around us. The second distinction is that to many people in the world around us, the formal doctrine of religion is regarded as not being relevant to the pressing problems of day-to-day life. So many people around us look upon religion as being concerned with so-called spiritual matters in a very narrow sense, matters that one addresses on Sunday rather than matters that are addressed during the working week, Monday through Friday. In contrast, we Baha'is believe that religion is concerned with the whole spectrum of human activities, the whole range of human endeavor 7 days a week. For example, the problem of the relationship between capital and labor is pressing in many countries of the world. The relationship between unions and management, the relationship between workers and owners. There are strikes, there are difficulties, there are lockouts, unemployment. Many problems derive from the inability of modern society to successfully solve the problem of harmonizing the relationship between capital and labor. We Baha'is believe that this problem has an important religious dimension to it. Why do I say this? Because Abdu'l-Baha, in some answered questions, devotes one of his talks to exactly this issue, to the question of the relationship between capital and labour. Since Abdu'l-Baha discusses it, it is a religious matter to Baha'is. And it is an example of the fact that we regard religion as being concerned with matters which outwardly seem so mundane, if you will, or so practical as capital and labour. Another example is that of the power of the press. And there is in our society increasing discussion of the responsibilities of the media to report news accurately, to give expression to the diversified views of society, to be dispassionate and unprejudiced in reporting. And there are many examples in our society of indoctrination, of manipulation of media interests in the name of some ideology. This is regarded as a very significant issue in our society. To Baha'is it is a significant issue, but much more than that, to Baha'is it is a religious question. Why do I say this? Because we find in the Baha'i writings that Baha'u'llah himself speaks of the responsibilities of the press and the duties and functions expected of members of the media to strive as a religious obligation to free themselves from prejudice and to be accurate in their investigation and reporting. Economics is regarded as a very complicated and very difficult science by its practitioners in our society. There are many schools of economic thought. Economic dislocation throughout the world is giving innumerable problems to human society in terms of unemployment, balance of payments and the like. This is clearly an important problem being faced by the world today. To Baha'is, it has a religious dimension to it because we have teachings which deal with the basis of economics, with the relationship between human attitudes and human desires and economic accomplishment. So in economics, in the relationship between capital and labour, in the question of the power of the media, the question of equality of the sexes, of racial equality, many other issues that are pressing in our society are regarded by Baha'is as having an important religious dimension. The point is simply this, that we believe religion has a role to play in the whole spectrum of human activities, not simply concerning itself with activities on Sunday or whatever day one chooses to assign to purely narrow religious activities. The third difference is that modern views of man do not take account of one factor which Baha'is regard as very important, and that factor is the power of the Holy Spirit. Modern views of man in general, and of course there are exceptions to this, are largely mechanistic. They state that if one is subject to a certain range of experiences in one's early life, the result will be this. They will have this kind of consequence. As Baha'is, we believe that human beings have access to an infinite power to change called the power of the Holy Spirit, coming from their Creator, channeled to them through their belief in the manifestation of God. And we believe that this power of the Holy Spirit enables an individual to make changes in his own makeup, in his being, in his personality and characteristics, which are miraculous, which go beyond the mechanistic framework. That he can overcome great disabilities, great difficulties and problems in his past through access to the power of the Holy Spirit. So our view of mankind is vastly more optimistic than that of the people around us. Our optimism is not derived simply from hope or desire. It is derived from our concept of the world as including within it the power of the Holy Spirit. Another distinction is that in the world around us, people generally regard God as playing a relatively passive role in human affairs. Most of the people in the world around us regard history as showing God interacting quite closely with human beings in the period of the Old Testament leading up to the coming of Christ. One reads the Old Testament about the vicissitudes of the children of Israel. One sees how they experienced certain difficulties, and prophets would appear, visionaries would give their message, and the people would turn back to the path to God. And so there was a process of spiritual and social evolution. But this process of interaction between the Israelites and God seemed to reach a termination with the coming of Jesus Christ. And since that time, history in the Western world at least is viewed in secular terms as simply being a consequence of human desires and activities and plans and activities, irrespective of the power of God and of divine influence. We Baha'is believe that history in the present day, as well as in the days of the Old Testament, that present day history equally should be viewed as being the consequence of the interaction between God and mankind. So we see the events of the 19th and 20th century as being best understood in terms of human response to divine influence and divine endeavours. More specifically, we regard the history of the last 100 or 150 years as being only clearly understood in terms of the coming of Baha'u'llah, Baha'u'llah's proclamation to the kings and religious leaders, the rejection of that proclamation by those kings and ecclesiastics, and the consequent processes of decline and growth which have occurred in the world as a result of Baha'u'llah's proclamation. So our view of God is of a creator in continuous interaction with mankind, rather than in an interaction which ceased 2,000 years ago. Finally, an important distinction between the Baha'i approach to religion and that of people in the world around us is that in the world around us, words used to describe religious concepts have become debased in meaning. And it is important that we Baha'is, using the same words, give those words a new meaning rather than give them the old meaning used by people around us. Let me take some examples. In the Baha'i writings we find mention of the word prayer, and this is a word that people use around us. But to many people the word prayer means a ritual, a meaningless ritual carried out of a sense of obligation, a sense of religious duty, sometimes carried out in a language one does not even understand. We use the same word, prayer, but we use it with a new meaning. The meaning we ascribe to the word prayer is something vivid, something dynamic, something alive, something that represents the human being turning to his Creator in devotion and adoration. To us, prayer is not only the set of words, it is also the activities of daily life, the attitude with which we approach other human beings. So in using the word prayer, we must be careful to avoid giving it the old, meaningless, ritual-type meaning, rather to give it the new, dynamic meaning. The word morality if one uses the word morality, to many people it is a synonym for Puritanism. If you say somebody is moral, what we really mean is he or she is a Puritan, a killjoy who regards smiling and laughing as being something unspiritual. If it's a female, she doesn't wear makeup. Either male or female, they wear dark clothes, very somber outlook, and regard anything joyful or happy as being somehow related to the work of the devil. Puritanism. To Baha'is, morality, the word moral, has a quite distinct meaning. To us, morality is that which liberates the human spirit, that which leads to enduring happiness, that which leads to meaningful and enduring human relationships. Our use of the word morality is with a radically different meaning from the meaning given to it by people of the world around us who have confused morality with Puritanism. The word spirituality. To the world around us, spirituality has acquired the meaning of impracticality. Somebody who is spiritual is, to the world around us, somebody who is impractical. Somebody who couldn't change a tire on an automobile if it had a flat tire. Somebody who doesn't know how to do things of a practical nature, who sits by himself contemplating vague and unknown mysteries. I remember when I was a student at Sydney University, some friends of mine told me that they had a friend who was very spiritual. I was very intrigued by this, and so I said to them, "How do you know he's very spiritual?" They said, "Well, he stays alone in his room all day and has a lighted candle and sits looking at that candle, and therefore he must be spiritual." I thought to myself, this is exactly what's wrong. That people are using the word spiritual as a synonym for impracticality, for something that's a little odd, that is not at all connected with the real world. To Baha'is, the word spiritual has a meaning defined from the example of the master Abdu'l-Baha. Because Abdu'l-Baha is our divine exemplar. By definition, he is our example of spirituality. And when we examine the life of Abdu'l-Baha, we see a man who was intensely practical, who was down to earth, realistic, who had a balanced and moderate view of life and of creation, of daily activity. So when we use the word spirituality, it is important that we give it the new meaning defined in the Baha'i teachings rather than the old debased meaning of the world around us. Finally, the word obedience. Obedience used in a religious setting is generally used with the connotation of denying one's own powers of discrimination and thought, of giving blind obedience to a set of formal statements that one had no choice in formulating. So quite naturally, people are turning away from religion because they do not wish to surrender their dignity, surrender their human rights in obedience blindly to some set of statements which are part of organized religion. In the Baha'i faith, we have the concept of obedience. And we have to be very careful to look at the new meaning given to the term obedience in the Baha'i context. To a Baha'i, obedience to the laws and ordinance of the manifestation of God is something that comes in a voluntary and joyful manner after a careful, rational investigation of the claim of the manifestation. Our faith is not blind faith. Our faith is a reasoned faith in the validity of the claim of the manifestation of God. And because of faith and obedience arise as a consequence of investigation. It is not something given blindly, and it does not involve the surrender of human dignity and of human powers. We see obedience to the laws of the manifestation of God as something which enables us to further develop our powers of discrimination, our powers of analysis, our powers of rational thought, to further heighten our intuitive and other faculties. So to us, obedience is something liberating rather than something confining. We see this religion not as a straitjacket, but rather as something that liberates and frees us. I remember hearing a talk many years ago by the hand of the cause Abdu'l-Baha Ruhiyya Khanum, and she described the Baha'i teachings and their effect on the individual as if one were walking on the shores of the sea, and the tide had gone out and there was a little fish trapped in a small rock pool of water. And one took this little fish out from the rock pool and put it in the vast ocean where it had a limitless dimension in which to swim. And she said that's what becoming a Baha'i is. Taking this fish from this small rock pool of very, very limited size and putting it in the vast ocean, giving it a freedom, a liberation that that fish could not possibly imagine when it was in the small rock pool. I would now like to discuss several basic Baha'i principles which underlie the Baha'i teachings on individual behavior. The first of these principles concerns the Baha'i concept of the nature of man. The Baha'i teachings, as I understand them, tell us that human beings live at one and the same time in two worlds. They live in the material world that we are all very well familiar with, that we experience through our senses. And in addition, the teachings tell us that Baha'is are living at one and the same time in a spiritual world. Further, the teachings go on to tell us that all our actions, everything we do at every time in our daily lives, is an action taken in both worlds and has a spiritual as well as a material consequence. It follows, therefore, that the truly successful life, the life that is meaningful and happy, is one where the actions of human life are carried out having regard to their spiritual as well as their material effect. Why? Because we are living in both worlds, and the effect of our actions in both worlds in turn has an effect upon our happiness and our sense of satisfaction and fulfillment. We're told by Abdu'l-Baha that man has two natures, his spiritual nature and his material nature. His spiritual nature inclines him towards the development of qualities that are regarded in religion as good, to become loving, become merciful, to become compassionate and kind and honest and the like. Whereas his material nature inclines him towards developing negative qualities, becoming hateful, antagonistic, prejudiced, and so on. The purpose of religion, as Baha'is see it, is to help the individual develop his spiritual nature, and in that way to free him from bondage to his material nature. Why is this important? Because true happiness and true fulfillment is found when we complete the purpose of our lives. And man, as a spiritual being, is endowed with the purpose of developing his spiritual nature. So in that sense, the purpose of religion, as Baha'is see it, is to produce happiness and fulfillment through providing a set of teachings which will free man from attachment and enslavement to his material nature. In this light, we can examine some of the statements in the Baha'i writings. For example, Baha'u'llah in one place says, "True liberty consisteth in man's submission unto my commandments." Initially, this looks contradictory. Quite often, people who are not followers of the Baha'i faith say, I could not join a religion with a set of teachings because then I would have to follow those teachings and this would restrict my freedom and my liberty. In fact, if they were to see it as we see it, the opposite is true. Through acceptance of the claim of Baha'u'llah, following investigation and analysis, prayer and meditation, through accepting the claim of Baha'u'llah and endeavoring to follow these teachings, one is freed from being trapped in slavery to one's material nature, and by being so freed, one is able to develop one's spiritual nature, and this is true liberty. And it is for this reason that Baha'u'llah says in the words I have read, which I now read again, "True liberty consisteth in man's submission unto my commandments." And one other phrase from Baha'u'llah, "By this means the peoples of the earth may attain unto abiding joy and be filled with gladness." In other words, through the development of our spiritual nature by following the divine commandments, we attain true happiness. Another basic Baha'i principle is that of our concept of the manifestation of God. Becoming Baha'is, we accept that Baha'u'llah is a manifestation of God. And what this means is that we accept that Baha'u'llah is inspired by God to tell us those things that lead to spiritual development. We investigate the claim of Baha'u'llah, we examine it, we come to our conclusions. Having accepted the claim of Baha'u'llah, what we have done is accept his claim to be a bringer of truth. It follows that having accepted Baha'u'llah's claim to be a bringer of truth, we give unquestioning obedience to whatever he tells us, irrespective of whether or not we see its purpose in the larger scheme of human affairs. One might well inquire, is this not blind faith? When we are talking about giving unquestioned obedience to the teachings of Baha'u'llah, are we not following blindly? The answer is no, we are not. Why? because our acceptance of the claim of Baha'u'llah comes about as a consequence of our own independent investigation. The claim is one to be a bringer of truth. Having accepted that claim, we accept that he is a bringer of truth, and therefore the consequence is that we regard his teachings as truth and we follow them without question. One finds that obedience to the teachings of Baha'u'llah is a prerequisite to understanding their deeper purpose and meaning. If I come across one of Baha'u'llah's teachings and I say to myself, I really don't understand why Baha'u'llah has said this, I will wait until I understand its meaning and purpose before I follow it. If I have this attitude, there's one thing I can be sure of. It's this: I'll never understand it. I'll never follow it. But if I say to myself, I don't understand the purpose of this teaching of Baha'u'llah, but it is definitely given by Baha'u'llah and I have accepted his claim, therefore I will follow it. If I do this, then sure enough, I will find that with the passage of time, understanding will come to my heart as a gift from God in response to my obedience and commitment. Through following the teachings with faith in Baha'u'llah, gradually over a period of time, the wisdom of these teachings will become apparent, and my commitment to Baha'u'llah will give its fruit in my deeper insight into the purpose and implication of these teachings. The third point I want to mention about basic Baha'i principles relating to the individual life is the purpose of tests. As Baha'is, we see the ideal life to be not a static condition, but a process of development. So often in the world around us, religion presents the ideal situation as a static one of unchanging attainment, a so-called paradise condition, where one sits around essentially being bored, with nothing else to do but just to bask in one's own achievement. Whereas, in fact, the ideal life from the Baha'i point of view is a process of growth and development and continuing evolution in one's spiritual qualities and in one's skills, talents and attainments. It is a process of continuing growth. And this process of growth involves challenge and test. We are told in the Baha'i writings that such challenge, such testing, such trials to one's commitment and to one's efforts are an inevitable part of the process of growth. And one of the principles of the Baha'i faith is to recognize the legitimacy, the appropriateness, and the value of such tests as being an indispensable part of one's development. There is one other principle that I want to mention, and that is the fact that in the Baha'i faith we do not believe in an independent force of evil in the world. One of the principles of the Baha'i faith is the principle of the non-existence of an independent force of evil in the world. One finds in the book Some Answered Questions a talk by Abdu'l-Baha on this subject, where he points out that the Baha'i teachings do not accept the existence of an independent force of evil, a devil or Satan or some such term. One finds, however, that in the Baha'i writings these terms are used. There are passages where Satan is referred to, or the devil or the evil one is mentioned in the Baha'i writings. And initially one says, well, how can this be so? On the one hand, here are these terms mentioned in the writings. On the other hand, Abdu'l-Baha says that there is no independent force of evil. If that be so, why are these terms being mentioned? This question has been clarified by the Universal House of Justice, and let me read the passage. The Universal House of Justice wrote, "The references to Satan, or the evil one, in Baha'i scripture are symbolical and do not at all imply the existence of a personal devil. They symbolize the lower nature of man, the selfish promptings of his ego, and so forth." So they are used symbolically to give dramatic emphasis to the capacity of man's material nature, his lower nature, to seduce him from the path of spiritual development. This view is quite distinct from that of so many religions in the world around us, some of which seem almost preoccupied with the question of evil and the existence of a devil and his machinations in the world. One finds that in many of these religions, the material world has been regarded as the province of the devil. The devil has been regarded as operating in the material world around us. And so people who have aimed at spiritual development have decided that the best way to achieve that development is to get away from the material world, to deny themselves the pleasures of the world in the hope that in this way they would become spiritual. In other words, they said to themselves, if the devil is in the world, the further I get away from the world, the more I'm getting away from the devil, the closer I'm coming to the spiritual realm. This is not a Baha'i view. It does not fit in with the Baha'i teachings. We do not believe that the devil is found in the material world because we don't believe in an independent force of evil. And the point I want to make is that as Baha'is, we do not in any way seek to deny the value of the pleasure, of the happiness that the world can offer. We do not feel that the path to spiritual development involves denying oneself the legitimate pursuit of happiness and comfort that is attainable in this world. Let me read a passage, or in fact a set of passages from the Baha'i writings which deal with this subject. Baha'u'llah in one place says, "A solitary life and severe discipline do not meet God's approval." In another place, Baha'u'llah refers to the fact that through following his commandments, and this is a passage, of course, I read a few minutes ago, the people of the earth may attain abiding joy and be filled with gladness. Again, the legitimacy of happiness, of joy, as being consonant with the process of spiritual development rather than being something which takes one away from spiritual development. The guardian of the faith, Shoghi Effendi, reiterated this point with great emphasis. He wrote on one occasion that the faith is not to be associated or confused with any form of asceticism or of excessive or bigoted Puritanism. Shoghi Effendi also wrote that the Baha'i faith aims to derive the fullest advantage and benefit from the manifold joys, beauties and pleasures with which the world has been so plentifully enriched by an all-loving Creator. So, the Baha'i faith rests upon principles which differ quite markedly from the principles animating religion in the world around us. We give full commitment to Baha'u'llah in accepting his claim to be a manifestation of God. We see in the Baha'i teachings a means to liberty, a means to freedom and joy and happiness. And the Baha'i approach to the development of the individual does not involve Puritanism, asceticism, or the denial of the legitimate pursuit of happiness and comfort. Rather, we see the world around us as being there for our benefit, as being there for our spiritual development, and being there for our happiness. The first comment I want to make is to call attention to the fact that the Baha'i teachings assign a large degree of responsibility to the individual Baha'i. By contrast to religions that have come to mankind in the past, which have included an ecclesiastical structure, and one was in main responsible to a priest, an ecclesiastic, a cleric of some kind, who took upon himself the function of supervising individual spiritual development. There is no priesthood in the Baha'i faith, there is no clergy, there are no ecclesiastics. The individual is largely responsible for his own behavior, for his own spiritual development. There are wonderful institutions of the faith to offer advice, guidance, and encouragement to the individual Baha'i. But essentially, the individual is free to choose the extent of his commitment to his development and the manner he follows in implementing the Baha'i teachings. Let me give you some examples. One of our very important Baha'i teachings is that of the importance of prayer, including obligatory prayer. Baha'u'llah has given 3 forms of obligatory prayer, and the Baha'i is free to choose each day which of those 3 forms he follows: a very short form, a longer prayer, or one of intermediate size. No other Baha'i has the right to come to me and say, "Peter, have you observed your obligatory prayer? Are you following? Are you saying your obligatory prayer?" It is a matter between myself and God. Another example. The Baha'i teachings provide that during a period of 19 days each year, A Baha'i is encouraged and expected as a spiritual obligation to observe a period of fasting, depriving oneself of food and drink between the hours of sunrise and sunset each day. And we are told that this is an important part of our spiritual practice, that it is a period in the year of spiritual spring cleaning, of refining our behavior and making a special effort to foster our spiritual development. It is a matter between the individual and his Creator. Nobody can come to me and say, Peter, are you observing the fast? Are you fasting today or are you not? It is nobody's business but mine and that of my Creator. And as I'm sure many people are aware, there are certain exceptions to the law of fasting. If one is ill, or if one is traveling, or other situations, one is not expected to fast. Another comment I'd like to make about the Baha'i teachings on individual behavior is that of moderation. The Baha'i faith defines a moderate way of life. Baha'is are expected not to become fanatics, not to become extremists. They're expected to aim to become reasonable, moderate people following a very reasonable and moderate way of life. And if you look at the Baha'i teachings in detail, you find overall this flavor of moderation and reasonableness coming through. This moderate approach has three components to it. One component consists of forms of behavior that are strongly encouraged: devotion, practice of the spiritual virtues, teaching the faith. All of these things are strongly encouraged as one facet of moderation. Another facet consists of things that are strongly discouraged to the point of prohibition. The consumption of narcotic or intoxicating drugs, the consumption of alcohol as a beverage, the participation in sexual relations outside marriage. These are all prohibitions in the Baha'i faith as another facet of the moderate way of life. And the third facet are those things that are encouraged in moderation. Moderation of dress, moderation of language, moderation of amusements. These three facets, things that are strongly encouraged, things that are strongly discouraged to the point of prohibition, and things that are encouraged in moderation, these three facets go together to define a moderate approach, a moderate way of life. If one were to look only at the things that are encouraged strongly and ignore the other two facets, one would get a distorted view and one would regard the Baha'is as fanatics. If one were to look only at the aspects of the Baha'i teachings where prohibitions occur and ignore the other two facets, one would regard the Baha'is as Puritans, as killjoys who have a religion of prohibitions. And that would be incorrect because there are three facets, not one. If one was to look only at the aspects of the Baha'i teachings which call for moderation, one would again distort the faith by omitting the other two facets, those items that are prohibited and those items that are strongly encouraged. My point is one needs to look at the whole ensemble of the Baha'i teachings as interlocking parts of a composite whole in order to get an accurate view of the way of life that the Baha'i teachings define. I've made some mention of sexuality, and I want to make the comment that after so many thousands of years, the Baha'i faith is a religion that offers accurate, precise and valuable statements about the question of human sexuality. And I want to read a couple of the statements from the Baha'i writings on this subject. In one place, the guardian of the faith, Shoghi Effendi, says, the Baha'i faith recognizes the value of the sex impulse. And in another place, he states, the proper use of the sex instinct is the natural right of every individual. How different this approach to sex is in the Baha'i faith from that of so many religions in the world around us. How natural, how healthy, how realistic it is to find that in the Baha'i faith we have the statement that it recognizes the value of the sex impulse. It doesn't deny it. It doesn't regard sex as inherently sinful or wrong or something to be avoided. However, the Baha'i teachings also have this following statement. The Universal House of Justice states, the Baha'i teaching on sexual intercourse is very clear. It is permissible only between a man and the woman who is his wife. So we have balance. On the one hand, the Baha'i faith recognizes the value of the sex impulse. On the other hand, the Baha'i teachings are that sexual relations are only permissible between a couple who are married to each other. And in that way, the stability of society and the foundation of marriage is preserved. There are other statements in the Baha'i teachings which give a broader dimension to this question. For example, Shoghi Effendi states, quoting Baha'u'llah, he says, Baha'u'llah says, adultery retards the progress of the soul in the afterlife. So grievous is it. These statements I have read are simply a sample to indicate that the Baha'i faith is a religion that has clear, practical, realistic guidance on questions such as those of human sexuality, which are an important aspect of individual behavior and individual development. And I have mentioned these passages to indicate that the Baha'i teachings on sex differ quite radically and quite markedly from the puritanical views of religions around us, which so often deny the value and the legitimacy of the sexual impulse. Another aspect of the Baha'i teachings on individual behavior is that Baha'u'llah has broadened the definition of immorality. Generally in the society around us, immorality is taken to refer entirely or almost entirely to the area of sexual relations. Whereas in the Baha'i faith, immorality is given a broader and in many ways more fundamental definition. For example, we are told in the Baha'i teachings that gossip and backbiting are immoral. Not only are they socially destructive, not only do they focus on the negative aspects of human behavior and human relations, but much more than that, they are immoral. The individual who engages in gossip and backbiting is carrying out an immoral act and is, for this reason, retarding his own personal spiritual development. So a Baha'i makes an effort to avoid gossip and backbiting, not simply because he wants to preserve some friendship with people, but much more than that, because it is his religious duty to do so. This gives the practice of avoiding gossip and backbiting much greater force in Baha'i individual life than is found in the society around us. The same applies to prejudice and discrimination on the basis of race or class or sex or educational background. To a Baha'i, such prejudice and discrimination is an aspect of immorality, and a Baha'i strives to eradicate such prejudice and discrimination from his behavior as a religious duty, much more than as a social duty. Finally, let me mention one theme which runs continually throughout the Baha'i teachings, and the theme is this: the emphasis in the Baha'i faith is placed on effort rather than achievement. In contrast to the values of the society around us, the values of the Baha'i faith are on effort rather than on accomplishment. It follows that each individual believer has immediately available to him the opportunity to perform works of great value and merit simply by making an effort to put the Baha'i teachings into practice. And another consequence of this emphasis on effort rather than achievement is the fact that in the Baha'i faith we have no way and no right to judge one another. It is wrong. We are not permitted to do it. We cannot do it even if we wanted to, because we have no way of assessing the amount of effort being made by another individual to practice the Baha'i teachings. We can, to some extent, assess achievement because it's measurable and observable, but we cannot assess effort. And as I have mentioned, in the Baha'i faith, the value and the emphasis is placed on effort rather than achievement. It follows that as Baha'i communities grow and develop and become mature, we find that they consist of individuals who are joined together in bonds of mutual support and cooperation, each one striving with an appropriate degree of effort to put the Baha'i teachings into practice. No one person judging another Baha'i, setting up categories to divide the Baha'i community, but all joining together to provide encouragement to each other to make the effort to put the Baha'i teachings into practice.